Hello, class. Today we'll be talking about lesson 3, which is titled David Conquers Enemies and is Defeated by Sin, which is going to cover 2 Samuel chapters 10 through 12. So in this first section, we're going to read about a conflict that David has with the Ammonites and the Syrians. So the king of the Ammonites, he's died, and so his son, whose name is Hanan, he takes over. So when David hears how this king has passed away, he thinks it's a good idea that he would send some servants over to Hanan to comfort him over his father's loss. So, however, he's doing this as a gesture of goodwill, but the princes of the Ammonites, they convince Hanan that David's doing this with he has a hidden reason for doing this. They convince him that really what David's doing, he's sending these men and they're really here just to spy out the land so that David can come back and conquer it later. So Hanan listens to their advice. And so when David's servants show up to Hanan, he takes the servants and he shaves off half their beards, and then he cuts their clothes, the Bible says, right at their buttocks. So you can imagine that's got to be pretty embarrassing. And it could be taken as an act of war. So, I mean, for instance, just think about if the U.S. today, we sent an ambassador to another country, and then when that ambassador shows up, the leader of that country shaves off that ambassador's hair and then, rips his pants off and then sends them back. Of course, that's humiliating. Anyone would be humiliated by that. And if we learned about that, or if that happened, we'd be hearing about it on the news and how, we might go to war with this country. It was an act of war. So very similarly, that's how David takes it. He's going to go to war with these people. So Hanan, when he does this, he knows that what he's done is going to upset the Israelites. So he knows he needs to prepare for war. So what he does is he goes out and he hires a bunch of soldiers from different nations around him. A couple of nations are mentioned, but the main one that makes up most of the numbers is the Syrians, which the Bible gives us the number of 20,000 soldiers. So the Ammonites have, their armies and then all these hired foot soldiers. So they got a lot going in their favor. But if you read on, you'll see that the armies of Israel prevail, and you can guess why. Guess who's on their side? The Lord, right? So you can read more about that conflict, but as I said, the Israelites come out victorious over that. In the next section, that will cover a story which you've probably all heard about before. It's a very famous story in the Bible. It's the story of David, Bathsheba, and Uriah. So one evening, David's out taking a walk on his roof, and just as a side to remember that, or know that the roofs over there are different than the roofs that we have here. Here we have, the pointed roof that you're not going to be able to walk on. But over there, they had flat roofs, and it would be more like a patio that's on top of your house. So anyway, this evening, David's out there and he's taking a walk, and he happens to see over, on the wayside, across the way, there's a woman, a very beautiful woman, and she's bathing herself. And so at this point, David should have just turned away and, went about his day. But unfortunately, that's not what happens. David, he's just too infatuated by this woman, and he wants to know more about her. So he asks his servants to find out who that is, and they tell her that's Bathsheba. She's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And by the way, Uriah, he's one of David's soldiers, but he's not just one of his soldiers. He's one of his elite soldiers. You might remember that I said that there was a group called David's Mighty Men. He's one of these guys. So he's very loyal to David, a loyal soldier. So David, like I said, he should have stopped, but he keeps on with the sin, and he's too he wants this woman too much for himself, and he just can't stop. So he takes this woman who's already the wife of someone and takes her for himself, which is a horrible sin. You can't just go and take someone else's wife. But the situation actually gets worse because we find out that Bathsheba actually becomes pregnant with David's child. So this sin that David is doing just keeps going deeper and deeper. And so at this point, rather than, confessing what he's done and coming clean, he tries to cover it up. And so what he does is he has Uriah brought back to him, who, by the way, while this was happening, was out fighting for David and his army. He has Uriah brought back to him, and he tries to trick Uriah and twice, actually, which you can read about. But basically, what he's trying to do is make Uriah think that whenever this child is born, that it's going to be his. But his plans failed both times. So now David's getting really desperate. And so eventually he comes up with a final plan, which is going to end up getting Uriah killed. And whenever Uriah is gone, then David can take Bathsheba for herself. So sure enough, this plan goes through, and you can read about the details of what he does. In fact, that's going to be one of the questions that you answer. Uriah dies, and David takes Bathsheba for himself. So in the third section, we're going to read about the consequences of David's sin. It seems like David's gotten away with what he did, but the Lord sends a prophet named Nathan to speak to David. And so Nathan shows up, and he tells David this story of a rich man and a poor man. So this rich man had everything he could ever want, all sorts of flocks and all sorts of riches. And this poor man, all he has is one little lamb. And this lamb is more than just another, animal. It says that, he raised it with his children. He loves it. It's very close to him. So you could think about it as kind of like it's a very close family pet, I guess you could kind of think about. So it's not just, some animal that he's going to eat later. Anyway, this rich man has some guests over, and he needs to feed them with some food. So he needs to kill one of his lamb to feed them. But rather than take one of his own lamb, he takes the poor man's. So when David hears about this, he's outraged, and he's demanding justice for the poor man. That's whenever Nathan reveals, David, you were the rich man in this story. And so at this point, David comes to his senses and realizes what he's done and confesses his sin. Now, David's confessed his sin, and even though you'll read that the Lord does forgive him, you need to pay attention here because, yes, he is forgiven, but Nathan gives some warnings about some bad things that are going to happen to David. So keep in mind, yes, he was forgiven, but that doesn't erase the consequences of his sin. So it's a very important lesson to learn here. So Nathan gives a warning about some bad stuff that's going to happen. He says adversity is going to rise up in his house, that David's wives are going to be taken, and then worst of all, that son that he was going to have with Bathsheba, that child's going to die. So sure enough, the child does become sick, and David's pleading with the Lord for that child's life. But as he was warned, David had to pay for his sin, and he has to live with those consequences. So that child does end up passing away. Finally, in the last section, we do get to end on a happier note. Yes, he just lost his son, but David's going to have another son with Bathsheba. And this son's name is Solomon, which you're going to learn a lot more about later. And then in the final section, you'll also learn about how David conquers one other Ammonite city. So you'll read about that. So that's the end of lesson 3, a very short version. As I said, you really need to read the lesson to get the full details, but what I just give here should give you a pretty good picture of what happens. By the way, I don't think I explained this in my last video, but on your handout, you'll notice that on the questions, at the end of the question, there's some numbers. Those are the chapter and verses, and I put those there to kind of help guide you to to know where to find the answer to that question. You'll also notice that there's some other questions that I put there, and I called them thought questions. I put these there not so much that you need to write down an answer for these, but I really wanted you to just read these questions and think about them and think about how they apply to your life. So that's all I had for today. So as I said, keep up with your reading, and we'll see you on the next class. So thanks for listening, and bye for now. All right, thanks.